Welcome to Veil of Epochs, the only history channel where we rip back the dusty curtains of time to find a sweaty peasant licking spoons for a living. You see, when we think of history, we usually imagine epic battles, powerful monarchs, and dramatic betrayals involving swords, crowns, and probably incest. But what we don't talk about are the jobs. Oh, the jobs. Not the cool ones, not knights or scribes or royal falconers with fabulous beards. I'm talking about the real workforce. The medieval gig economy. The people whose job titles sound like dares made during a tavern drinking contest. Want to be a royal tongue scraper? Sure. You'll get up close and personal with medieval dental hygiene, a sentence that should come with a content warning. How about a poison tester? It's just Russian roulette but with cheese. Or my personal favorite, a ghost bed warmer. That's right. You warm a haunted bed. For royalty. While ghosts are still using it. So buckle in. Grab your ale. And prepare for 90 minutes of absolutely baffling career advice from the 14th century. Because today we're diving into medieval job interviews be like a tale of questionable employment, spiritual confusion, and enough bodily fluids to cancel this video in most countries. This is Veil of Epochs. And we're here to prove once and for all, history isn't just weird, it's unemployed and slightly cursed. The medieval job market, a thrilling landscape of opportunities. Provided you didn't mind dying young, smelling awful, or being accused of witchcraft every time you looked slightly competent. Unlike today, where you can just lie on your resume and get away with it. In the 1300s your qualifications were mostly, you're alive, you have teeth. Optional, you're not actively bleeding in front of your employer. Which brings us to one of the most glamorous positions available at court, the royal poison tester. Now, the job description is simple. Really. You eat stuff. That's it. But, and it's a very important but, you eat it before the king does. Because if there's poison in that lavish roasted swan with saffron sauce, guess who gets to find out first? That's right. Not His Majesty. You. Jeff the peasant. Son of Brederick the slightly burned. You see, medieval royalty had this tiny little problem called everyone wants to kill me. Especially during feasts. Because nothing says political coup like slipping a little belladonna into the gravy. So kings started hiring people to taste their food. Which sounds cute until you realize your job security is literally tied to your digestive resilience. If you made it through lunch, great. You lived. If you didn't, well, there's a new opening in the tasting department. And don't think you got paid handsomely either. Royal poison testers were usually servants. Sometimes even enslaved people. Or criminals offered a deal. As in, taste this. Die quickly and painlessly. Or rot in a dungeon and die slowly with rats chewing your kneecaps. Now you might be wondering, did this ever work? Not really. Half the time. Poisons didn't kill immediately, they took hours. Sometimes days. By the time the tester keeled over with internal bleeding, the king had already ordered dessert. There's even a case in ancient Rome. Yes. We're cheating a little with the timeline, where Emperor Claudius poisoned a woman named Locusta, real name, real job. Actually trained testers to build up immunity. Kind of like medieval vaccine trials. But with more convulsing. So what did you need to succeed in this line of work? Iron stomach. No friends. A very forgiving relationship with fate. And, ideally, a will already written, preferably in pig's blood. Because that's what they had. And here's the best part, if you did survive long enough, you might be promoted to nothing. You just keep testing soup until you drop dead or a new monarch decides your services are no longer required. Usually with a sword. But hey, at least you didn't have to update LinkedIn. So, let's say you survived the poison tasting gig. Congratulations. Your stomach lining now has the resilience of a dragon's hide. And you're still technically breathing. What's next on the medieval career ladder? Well, friend, may I interest you in scraping the king's tongue? Yes. You heard that right. Not his boots. not his plates, his tongue. Back before the invention of toothpaste, or boundaries, medieval oral hygiene was essentially a chaotic art form. The upper class, bathed in perfumes and moral superiority, still somehow smelled like a combination of goat sweat and spoiled custard. Naturally, this extended to the royal mouth. And what did we do when the king's breath could wilt crops? We invented the tongue scraper. No. It wasn't a chic copper Ayurvedic tool like you'd find on TikTok wellness influencers. This was more like a tiny medieval pedal. Sometimes bone. Sometimes brass. Sometimes just a sharpened spoon. And if you were truly lucky, it had a handle. If you were unlucky, it was your finger. The job was simple. Every morning, at the crack of dawn, you marched up to the royal bedchamber, bowed deeply, and proceeded to clean His Majesty's tongue like it was a prized horse hoof. All while trying not to make eye contact, or throw up. Your responsibilities included scraping off tongue moss, a polite term for medieval plaque sludge, collecting it, yes. It was often saved for medical study or religious interpretations. Then disposing of it, possibly by feeding it to dogs, or burying it under a moonstone during retrograde. Sources differ. Now, this wasn't a job just anyone could do. No, there was protocol. You had to be gentle, respectful, and possess what chroniclers of the time called a steady hand and a dead nose. Imagine it. You're holding a brass scraper in one hand and a bowl in the other. The king yawns, revealing his royal dental disaster. Bits of roasted pheasant from 3 nights ago are still lodged near the molars. Your job is to go in and, well, get it. Why didn't they just brush their teeth? You ask. Because that would be rational. And medieval Europe specialized in anything but. Toothbrushes were rare, often made from twigs or pig bristles. But even those were considered too common for nobility. So instead, they hired people to be the tools. And it gets worse. The tongue scraper was sometimes also tasked with sniffing the king's breath and making notes. Yes, there were royal ledgers where you'd write down things like, Day 14, His Majesty's breath smells of onions, rage, and mild despair. And if the breath changed dramatically, it was believed to be a sign of divine displeasure or illness. Because clearly, the best way to diagnose plague was by deep-throating the king. Fun fact, in some courts, the tongue scraper doubled as the mouth physician. They'd scrape, sniff, and sometimes, if they were bold, offer a remedy. Usually wine with crushed herbs, or simply more wine. The job, as you can imagine, didn't come with a retirement plan. Most of the time, if the king got sick, you were blamed. Because nothing says job security like being told, the monarch has a sore throat. You must have scraped too hard. Also, if you caught something from your royal patient, say, syphilis, tuberculosis, or whatever medieval horror lurked in royal spit, you were quietly dismissed, or buried. Still, historians believe some tongue scrapers were weirdly proud of their job. Why? Because you got close to the king. Physically. Literally inside his face. Which, in that context, was seen as a privilege. Would you want to be remembered for that? Probably not. But hey, this was a time when being alive at 40 made you a village elder. So, perspective. Let's say you didn't make the cut as a poison tester, maybe your stomach gave up at the second dose of suspicious gravy. And scraping royal tongues? Too moist. But don't worry. The Middle Ages had one more vacancy for you. That's right, you, dear listener, could become the person who sleeps with ghosts professionally. No. Not metaphorically, not as a joke, not as a weird Tinder bio. Literally, people were hired to sleep in haunted rooms to chase off spirits. Now, to truly appreciate the lunacy here, we must first remember that medieval people believed ghosts were absolutely real. Like, pale guy in the corner whispering in Latin real. If you so much as heard a creaky floorboard, it wasn't the wind, it was your dead Uncle Reginald. Back for vengeance and probably still annoyed you didn't attend his funeral feast. So naturally, Whenever someone died tragically, violently, or just inconveniently near your bedroom, their ghost was expected to hang around, sighing dramatically and throwing pewter mugs at the wall. Entire castles were considered unusable unless someone braver, poorer, or drunker than everyone else agreed to sleep in the ghost's bed and prove it was no longer haunted. And that's where you came in, the ghost bed warmer. Part spiritual warrior, part human guinea pig, part insomniac. Now, medieval people didn't have ghostbusters. They had Gerald the butler's nephew, who once claimed he wasn't that scared of dead things and was thus promoted to official spirit sleeper. Your job: sleep in the room that everyone else refused to enter. Stay there until sunrise. If you survived, the house was declared spiritually cleansed. If you didn't, well, that just confirmed the haunting. And now they had two ghosts. You might think this was a fringe role. It wasn't. In both European and Asian cultures, there are documented cases of families or monasteries hiring someone to sleep in haunted places. In England, they might send a young monk into a crypt to test the presence of unrest. In parts of Eastern Europe, peasant boys were paid with bread, beer, and a vague promise of land if they survived the week. The ritual? Very scientific: lie in bed, light a candle. Optional: say a prayer, wait for something horrible to happen. If the candle flickered, ghost. If the sheets moved, definitely ghost. If you woke up in another room, ghost. Or wine. Either way, ghost. Sometimes these sleeping sessions turned into full-on public events. Villagers would gather outside the haunted cottage with snacks, watching from a safe distance, betting on whether young Thomas would make it through the night or get possessed and start speaking backwards. And of course, it wouldn't be medieval without a touch of sexually repressed panic. There are actual records of ghost sleepers being warned not to engage with seductive spirits. Yes, seductive ghosts were apparently a problem. Medieval monks wrote long, tortured letters to each other like, "Brother Alfric was visited in the night by a pale woman with dark hair and unnatural hips. He is recovering." The church, naturally, blamed this on demons. Peasants blamed it on ghosts. We, in the modern age, might just call it sleep paralysis and an overactive imagination. But if you're wondering what happened if the sleeper claimed they saw nothing, well, then the job was a success. And they were paid in, not dying. You see, ghost sleepers were rarely rewarded with coin. Usually it was a hunk of bread, a goose, sometimes alive, or, if you were really lucky, permission to marry someone's third cousin. What a time to be alive. And this, dear listener, is why if you ever find yourself complaining about your current job, maybe it's boring, or the coffee's bad, or your boss breathes too loudly, just remember, at least you don't have to prove your bravery by sleeping in a plague-ridden, goat-haunted barn while monks chant outside and someone tosses bones at the window just to see what happens. So far, we've survived poisoned duck, oral spelunking, and sexy ghosts. You might think, surely, this was the bottom of the barrel when it came to medieval employment. Oh no. Oh no no no. The barrel has a trapdoor. And we're diving in. Because next on the job list is someone who, depending on the kingdom, may have gone by titles like physician's assistant, flatulence examiner, or the royal fart sniffer. Now, let's clarify, this wasn't a joke job. In certain medieval medical traditions, bodily smells were believed to offer key insights into a person's health, especially the more personal aromas. Doctors, or more often their unfortunate apprentices, were tasked with smelling and evaluating flatulence for imbalance in the humors. Yes, doctors smelled farts to figure out whether your liver was sad or if your blood had too much heat. Not metaphorically, literally. And it makes sense, in the worst way possible. You see, medieval medicine was based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Each fart, they believed, revealed which humor was dominating. A sulfurous blast? Too much bile. A fishy whiff? Probably phlegm imbalance. Anything too quiet and warm? That's melancholy. or indigestion, or just trauma. So, how did this work in practice? Imagine a royal court. The king, bloated from a 6-course meal of eels, honey, and existential dread, rings a bell. His physician scurries in, followed by an assistant holding a linen sniff cloth. The king lifts a cheek, and the assistant leans in. Now, don't worry, they didn't always smell directly. Sometimes it was filtered through cloth, or collected in a fumigation jar for later analysis. This was science. After all, there are manuscripts, yes, real ones, that include statements like, the patient's wind was of a sweet yet putrid flavor, indicating warmth in the spleen and misfortune in the bowels. Misfortune in the bowels. Imagine writing that on your resume. These fume readers could be monks, doctors in training, or sometimes servants. And like everything in the medieval world, status mattered. A nobleman's gas was treated with scholarly curiosity. A peasant's blamed on demons or bad cabbage. And if you were particularly skilled at this line of work, say, if you could distinguish between spiritual and dietary flatulence, you might be invited to join the medical guild. A proud title, he who interprets winds. This position wasn't just limited to farts. By the way, medieval physicians were also known to taste urine for sweetness, examine sweat for coloration, and yes, evaluate the odor of the soul via armpits, because back then, medicine wasn't about germs. It was about vibes. And so you ended up with a royal court full of semi-educated guesses sniffing every bodily function like medieval sommelier. Notes of iron. Touch of panic. Definitely plague adjacent. Now, one might ask, why? Why build a career on sniffing monarchal methane? Because, my friend, data. The pre-modern world had no thermometers, no microscopes, no diagnostics beyond the physical senses. Your best bet at telling someone they were about to die was literally based on their color, their voice, their bodily stench. Which means if you were the best at interpreting these things, you were respected, trusted, sometimes even feared. There's a 14th century physician who once declared that a noble woman's sudden change in flatulence was a sign of sin. She was promptly exorcised, and probably divorced. So yes, medieval society could be toppled by a fart, and someone, possibly you, got paid to notice. So by now, you're thinking, surely, we're out of weird jobs. But oh, no, see. Once you accept that farts can predict the future, the medieval job market opens up like an overripe plague blister. Let's start with the urine prophet. Now, this wasn't a guy yelling at puddles. This was a real medical role, especially popular in England, France, and anywhere else people had bladders and absolutely no germ theory. Urine was believed to hold the essence of your health. So, physicians, or more often traveling piss prophets, would carry urine charts, which looked like watercolor wheels of doom. They'd match the patient's pee color and flavor, yes. They often tasted it, to one of 20+ diagnoses. Examples include, pale yellow, healthy, or possibly cowardice, reddish brown, hot liver, milky white, ghost infection. Don't ask. Some would even make long-distance diagnoses. You'd pee into a jar, send it by donkey across the countryside, and the prophet would sniff and sip before writing back, thy humours are damp. Avoid cheese and lust. And somehow, this was safer than most treatments available. Now, if you didn't get better after the prophet's advice, you'd call in another expert, the leech keeper. Yes, the medieval version of a blood bank. These brave souls farmed, transported, and applied leeches as medicine. Because obviously, if you're sick, the answer is to lose blood. Leech keepers carried special boxes, often strapped to their thighs, and would open them up like a sommelier presenting vintage wine. Ah yes, a 3-year-old swamp leech, robust bite, excellent for hysteria and swollen elbows. The logic here came from the same four humours nonsense. If someone was hot and wet, as in feverish, You applied a creature whose entire personality was drink blood and vibe. Leeches were kept in barrels or special bags made of sheep intestine. And it was your job to keep them alive, clean, and ready to slurp at a moment's notice. If one died, you didn't get fired. You got blamed for the patient dying later. Next, let's move to something a little more theatrical. Introducing the professional mourner. A person, usually a woman, hired to cry at your funeral. In medieval and early Renaissance societies, it was believed that the dead could not rest unless they were mourned loudly. So if you died unpopular or friendless, say, from inventing the tongue scraper, your family would pay someone to show up and scream dramatically. These mourners were trained performers. They'd wail, rip their clothing, sometimes beat their chest or faint strategically. One famous mourner in Florence in the 1400s was so good at fake fainting that she got hired by multiple rival families for the same day. And get this, they were sometimes graded on volume. A. Maria only sobbed at 7/10. I expected at least one full body collapse. The church later tried to ban this practice for being too pagan, which is a hilarious thing to say when you're surrounded by relics, incense, and a guy waving a thigh bone under moonlight to bless the harvest. And finally, as we round out this horrifying little HR catalogue, let's talk about one of the most essential and least glamorous jobs in the medieval world, the plague body collector. Catchy name, right? When the Black Death hit, corpses started piling up like Renaissance Jenga. Cities needed people to collect, transport, and dispose of the dead. These people were usually criminals, outcasts, or men who were just very drunk and very desperate. They wore long robes soaked in vinegar, which they thought was protective, and sometimes birdbeak masks filled with herbs to filter the miasma. In reality, they looked like Gothic storks in a hell parade. Their job was simple: find the bodies, load them onto carts, ring a bell so people knew to stay inside, dump the bodies into mass graves. Some sang hymns, some just swore loudly and hoped for the best. One recorded plague worker in 1349 London wrote, "I cannot feel my toes. That is either the cold or death approaching. Either way, no refunds." These people were the unsung heroes of disaster. But also, no one liked them. They were shunned in the streets, and sometimes not allowed to return to their homes after the plague passed, because who knows what ghosts they brought with them. So, in case you're keeping track, we've tasted royal spit, we've slept with ghosts, we've sniffed fart jars, we've measured sadness in urine, we've fake sobbed over strangers, and we've shoveled Europe's worst leftovers. And somehow, this was considered normal employment. In a world without Twitter, where do you go to publicly destroy someone's dignity? Simple. You hire a professional shamer. That's right. Medieval Europe may have lacked electricity, indoor plumbing, and any understanding of bacteria, but they were absolute pioneers in the art of public humiliation. Let's begin with one of the most elegant job titles in all of history, the town crier. Now, when we think of a town crier, we imagine a jolly man in a feathered hat, ringing a bell and yelling, hear ye, to announce taxes, marriages, or spontaneous jousts. But in reality, this guy was also responsible for announcing criminal charges in the most brutal way possible, reading out punishments with spice, and sometimes yelling insults written by the local magistrate. Yes, imagine getting arrested for stealing apples, and the next morning a sweaty man in a doublet shows up shouting, "Behold, Roger of Swinemouth, who pilfered 5 apples and 3 morals from Widow Gwen. May his fingers shrivel and his cider turn sour." That was someone's actual job. But it didn't stop there. The town crier often worked alongside the public shame manager, a catch-all term I just invented to describe the poor sap responsible for making your punishment as humiliating as possible. For example, stole bread? Into the stocks you go. Gossiped too much? Welcome to the scold's bridle, a lovely metal mouth cage with a bell. Cursed the priest? You're now wearing a donkey costume while sweeping the church steps. Yes, Many punishments came with costumes. And yes, someone had to design, prepare, and apply those costumes. They were like a theatrical costume designer, but for emotional devastation. Even the stocks, those iconic wooden boards with holes for your limbs, weren't just a punishment. They were a social event. People gathered around, threw rotten food, and heckled you. Sometimes, the local children were encouraged to mock you as part of their education. Imagine explaining this to a modern HR rep. So your job was making sure the accused had enough moldy turnips thrown at them. Also yelling jokes. And bell ringing. Lots of bell ringing. And just like any medieval job, status mattered. A noble might sit on a velvet bench inside a walled garden to contemplate his misdeeds. A peasant, into the mud pit, in a hat that said "I kissed the milkmaid and lied about it." Now, here's where it gets weirder. In some towns, repeat offenders were turned into literal warnings. You'd be paraded through the village with a wooden sign describing your crime. I spat in soup. I lied about cheese prices. I sang rude songs during Lent. And in some French towns, there was a guy called the Donneur-de-Nantes, literally, giver of shame. His job was to ring a bell, call your name, shout shame. Yes, really, and follow you home, just in case the message hadn't landed. Basically, he was the prototype for that nun in Game of Thrones. This man had no weapons, no armor, just the unshakable confidence of a man who could ruin your entire day with tone and vowels. Oh, and let's not forget the shame sculptors. Not official title, but a real concept. Artists who carved mocking faces into punishment devices. If you got sentenced to the pillory, the wooden frame might have a carved devil pointing at your head, Latin graffiti that said "sinful cabbage man," or a cherub rolling its eyes forever. Because even while being punished, you were part of the aesthetics. Now, of course, not all shamers were officially hired. Some were freelance. Medieval towns had mob shaming days, where locals were encouraged to air their grievances by marching through the streets yelling at public figures. It was like Yelp, but with more mud and medieval profanity. "Hey, Albert, your beer tastes like rotten ferret." "Susan, you stole my hens and my husband." "Barnaby, your goat smells of witchcraft." And finally, there's a job that lives on in spirit even today. The insult inventor. This was often the local jester or the scribe who wrote the punishment scrolls. Their job was to invent creative ways to describe your crimes in maximum roast format. Instead of "he lied," it might say, "he spreads truths as faithfully as a leaky bucket carries wine." Instead of "he cheated," it might say, "he shares his love as recklessly as rats share fleas." Truly, the Shakespearean burn was born here. And someone, somewhere, got paid in bread, beer, or possibly haunted chickens for writing them. Let's talk about the royal animal caretakers. No, not knights, not falconers. We're diving deeper, because if you thought your job was weird, try being the guy known as the Goose Whisperer to the Bishop of Winchester. Yes, that's a real thing. In some records, bishops, spiritual leaders, had emotional support geese. These geese were said to protect them from evil, loneliness, and the occasional heretical mood swing. Now, of course, someone had to feed them, wash them, walk them, and, should the goose die, mourn it properly. One monk even wrote in a marginal note, "We buried the goose by the chapel with full hymn and 6 tears." You think HR's bad? Try explaining to your boss why the holy goose is missing. And it didn't stop at geese. Some noble courts had official cat guardians, responsible for keeping plague-ridden rats at bay and brushing the cat's fur lest it look too common. Swan masters, whose job was to manage angry swans during royal feasts. There were actual swan registries. And in one Danish court, a bear butler, whose whole job was to ensure the king's pet bear didn't maul the help during dinner. Which leads us to, how many people were employed purely to prevent aristocrats from being devoured by their own menagerie? Answer, not enough. Now if you weren't noble enough for goose duty, or brave enough for bear shift, you might still find employment as a wartime chicken courier. Pigeons? Too expensive. Falcons? Too regal. Chickens? Terrible flyers. But easy to guilt trip. So in certain low-budget militias, messages were tied to chickens and tossed over castle walls. If the enemy caught them, no worries. That message was probably just scent soup, scene shift, flickering torchlight, echoing footsteps, unsettling chanting in Latin. Now, onto something darker. Superstition-based jobs. Because when you live in a world where the sun is confusing and comets mean God's mad, your career options get esoteric. First up, the Sin Eater. No, that's not a metal band. It's a real job, usually held by a poor man at the edge of town. Here's the idea: when someone died, their sins were still clinging to the body. Couldn't have that, not with Judgment Day pending. So, a Sin Eater would be summoned. They'd place a piece of bread or cake on the corpse's chest, absorb the spiritual gunk, then eat the food, metaphorically digesting the dead person's sins. Payment, coins, food, or not being yelled at by ghosts. Theologians hated this, but communities loved it. Nothing says closure like watching your uncle's sins get eaten in real time. And yes, people judged the Sin Eater harshly. He was believed to become spiritually filthy over time, which is rough when your job is literally saving souls with sandwiches. Then there was the Toad Doctor. Warts? Bad dreams? General aura of cursedness? Bring in the guy with a sack of toads. Toad doctors believed ailments came from spiritual imbalance, or bad humors in the blood. So they'd strap a toad to your chest, wait for it to die, and then declare, "The toad hath absorbed your ailment. You may now drink wine and sin again." Medical miracle? No. Free frog skin necklace? Absolutely. Let's not forget witch smellers, often elderly women or reclusive men who claimed they could literally smell witchcraft. They'd sniff your house, your clothing, or your vibes and say, "This woman's stew burns too evenly. She's obviously in league with the devil." These folks caused more drama than astrology TikTok and had the power to launch a full village panic. But hey, it paid well. Fear always does. Scene, candlelit room. Scrolls piled high. An exhausted scribe sighs while dipping a feather quill into black ink. Now, to wrap this round, let's talk early bureaucracy. Because for every leech handler and ghost bed warmer, there was a poor soul trying to write it all down. Enter the royal scribe of grain. Yes, an actual person whose job was to count wheat every single day. This scribe had to record how much grain came in, who took how much, whether anyone sneezed on it. One chronicler wrote, "I counted 30 sacks today. I am 30 years old. I have counted every year. I no longer dream in color." Even worse was the urine tax assessor. In 13th century England, urine was taxed when used in tanneries. So someone had to check how much pee you had. That's right, a bureaucrat with a measuring stick, standing in a puddle of your business. And finally, the parish bellwinder, the guy whose entire existence revolved around pulling a rope at the right time. Birth bell, death bell, midnight goat haunting, triple bell. These people had strict schedules, terrible posture, and probably arms like Hercules, but no social clout. You try impressing someone at the tavern by saying, "I rang 37 bells this week and only cried twice." Let's dig deeper into the strange abyss of medieval employment, where necessity, superstition, and unhinged creativity collided to form some of the weirdest job titles human history has ever seen. We're heading now into a realm that modern HR would call very much not OSHA compliant, featuring roles so wild they feel made up. And yet, tragically, they weren't. It's a foggy medieval alleyway. Suspiciously so. A distant scream is heard, followed by the wet slap of a fish. Let's begin with a job that blends danger, odor, and a shocking lack of safety protocols. The gong farmer. No, they didn't farm musical instruments. They farmed human waste. Specifically, they were hired to climb down into medieval cesspits, the underground tanks where chamber pots were emptied, and shovel out the centuries of accumulated Well, everything unholy that ever left a human body. They did this by candlelight, in total darkness, surrounded by a methane-rich atmosphere, with a shovel and optimism. They were forbidden to work during the day because of the smell. So they worked at night, often knee-deep in what 14th century writers politely called night soil. The pay? Surprisingly good. Why? Because literally no one else wanted the job. The smell never left their clothes, or hair, or soul. Imagine dating one. So what do you do for a living? Well, I descend into a toxic underworld and scoop Satan's porridge into buckets. You're brave. I'm covered in regrets. But here's the kicker, they were essential. Without them, towns would drown in their own waste. Quite literally. During the summer, if a gong farmer's work was delayed, entire neighborhoods would erupt into a plague disco. And not the fun kind. And their collected material? Sold to farmers. That's right, your medieval carrots were fertilized with last year's ale regrets. Elsewhere in a cramped tower room, a skinny man stares into a glass bottle filled with something yellow. He sighs, dips a feather into the liquid, and scribbles notes. Behold, the piss prophet. No, I'm not being crass. That was a real diagnostic role in medieval medicine. Before microscopes or germ theory, doctors would analyze a patient's urine to figure out what was wrong with them. And while any physician could glance at your pee and make assumptions, the true analysis came from the professionals, the uroscopists, aka pee whisperers. They would observe the color. Is it red? Bad. Is it blue? Probably witchcraft. Smell it? Yes. Really? Shake the bottle to see foam consistency. Compare it to a helpful illustrated chart showing all 20+ shades of medieval pee and their spiritual consequences. One even claimed he could tell your star sign based on your bladder output. Patients were told not to drink wine before appointments, lest it interfere with the diagnosis, which was rich, considering wine was 80% of the medieval food pyramid. A 13th century medical manuscript helpfully states, urine that sings when poured is cause for concern. Yes. Singing pee. A medical emergency. And they got paid for this. Not in exposure. In actual coin. One particularly successful piss prophet even had his own apprentice, meaning there was a man out there teaching someone else how to do advanced bladder-based fortune telling. Now imagine a crumbling church, overgrown with ivy. A man wearing too many robes frantically searches the pews for something invisible. It's time to meet a rare, highly respected professional, the relic hunter. In the medieval Catholic world, relics, pieces of saints, their clothing, bones, or even toenail clippings, were believed to have supernatural power. So of course, this meant, every church wanted relics. Not every church had relics. Some people got creative. Enter, the relic hunter. These were men who traveled around Europe trying to locate genuine relics in dusty monasteries, bargain, beg, or steal them, or just fake it. One famous case involves the skull of Saint John the Baptist, which somehow existed in no less than 6 different towns. Another church proudly displayed the feather of the Holy Spirit, a literal bird feather, framed. But the job wasn't all scams and shenanigans. Relic hunters had to navigate dangerous terrain, convince monks to part with bones, identify frauds, like Jesus's baby teeth, all 12 of them, and sometimes acquire pieces of corpses under very suspicious circumstances. It was archaeology meets black market trading meets church politics, with occasional exhumation. And yes, relics were big business. Some relics made towns fabulously rich. Pilgrims came by the thousands. Donations poured in. Local bakeries boomed. There's even a documented case of a relic thief sneaking into a rival cathedral, stealing a saint's shinbone, and replacing it with a wooden replica. The other church didn't notice for 10 years. And there you have it, a noble procession of the weirdest LinkedIn profiles history ever forgot. From the human canaries who sniffed out poison for royalty, to the gong farmers who single-handedly prevented medieval towns from turning into poop-based Pompeii, to the piss prophets who quite literally read your fate in a bottle of pee. These were the unsung heroes, the unpaid interns of fate. The side characters in history's big drama. Each with a job description that reads like a dare. It's easy to laugh at them now, and oh, we should, but deep down, there's a weird respect for the sheer commitment these people had. Imagine showing up to work every day knowing your duties involved excrement, ghosts, or holy toenails, and saying, "Yup, this is my calling. Let's go." And remember, in 600 years, someone might look back at our own jobs and say, wait, they had full-time influencers? Who just unboxed soap and said slay? Every era has its bizarre. Ours is just better filtered. So the next time your boss gives you a weird assignment, or your coworker shares their 6th astrology reading of the week, just take a deep breath and say to yourself, at least I'm not licking the king's spoon to check for poison. History is a fever dream, and someone had to mop the floor after it. Thanks for watching. And may your job never involve ghosts, excrement, or interpretive urinalysis. Unless that's your thing. In which case, slay, I guess.